So now we're on the Live Camera tab. In this release, we've modernized RSpec to be more effective with large format, fast frame rate video cameras. First, a minor cosmetic change. We've moved the open button over here to the left side because some new users had trouble finding the button when it was covered by the right panel. I'll click on the button and I'll select this ZWO camera. What we're seeing here is a live spectrum of a lamp, not a star, here on my lab bench. The first thing to look at here is that the layout in this region is a bit different than in previous releases, but nothing too dramatically different. There's this new frame counter here, and this field shows the current frame rate as processed by RSpec. And this field allows you to limit the frame rate. And finally, here's the size of the frames we're receiving from the camera. So right now, RSpec is processing about 13 frames per second on a camera that has frames that are 3096 by 2080. We'll see more about that in just a moment. And see this gear icon? It's the old configure button. It still pops up a submenu, like the old configure button did, but you know, submenus require 2 clicks. Once to open the submenu and a second to select the item. And frankly, I could never remember what the difference was between properties and settings. These both pop up a vendor-specific window, so they're really tough to give a good descriptive name to. So to make access to the submenus easier, there are now these 2 additional buttons, 1 and 2, that do the same thing, but require 1 less click and have generic names. Here's the screen that the ZWO company pops up on button number 1. Mainly, you're selecting frame size here. So here's the thing about frame size. When we're doing video spectroscopy, we're not interested in wide field views. All we really need is our star in the spectrum. So there's no reason to drag along 6, 8, maybe even 16 megapixel frames with all their high cost of processing. So let's shrink this frame down to say 1920 by 1080 pixels, and then we'll click OK. This smaller frame size will run more quickly. You can see the software is now showing the new frame size coming from the camera. A moment ago, we saw RSpec handle much larger frames, but this smaller frame will leave additional CPU processing power for RSpec to use, at times making the program much more responsive. The other thing in spectroscopy is, unlike visual video imaging, we generally don't stack hundreds or thousands of images. So we really don't need fast frame rates. In fact, of course, on astronomical targets, rather than this lamp on my lab bench, we'll need longer and longer exposures. We can configure RSpec to limit the frame rate to, say, 2 or 3 frames a second. Let's do that here with this combo box. When we click button number 2 down here, ZWO shows us this configuration screen. Here's where you'll set your gain and exposure for your particular needs, given your target's brightness, your telescope size, and so forth. Each camera manufacturer will show their own different window here. Let's look at this region of interest tab. Here we can see that, of course, you can move around in a cropped image to help you acquire and center your target. When you're initially acquiring your target, you'll probably use this tab and definitely the previous exposure levels tab a lot. Okay, let's close this screen. Now you see this gear over here? When we click on it, it pops up this video statistics window that can be very helpful. It shows the frame rate from the camera, and it shows the frame rate that RSpec is processing those frames. You probably won't need this frame size section, but this box allows you to cap the frame size in RSpec itself. Normally, we suggest you configure frame size on the camera itself using the number 1 screen we saw earlier rather than here in the software. And finally, you can use these 2 checkboxes down here to flip the image horizontally or vertically if you need to. Another big change in this release is the re-engineered histogram stretch screen. It's much, much faster. So here, even at 3 or even 10 or 15 frames per second with large images, we can stretch the entire image in real time. This is really helpful when you're trying to acquire a target, since the histogram stretch screen often reveals faint details. This particular video isn't a good example of the stretch. We'll see that later on. When doing video spectroscopy, there are 2 features that you should be aware of because they consume so many computer resources. The first one I mentioned earlier, the rotate button. As I mentioned, rotating millions of pixels a second is expensive. So again, we encourage you to spend a little more time getting your grating mounted so you don't need any rotation. The other big resource hog is the pixel map. You may recall that the 2D pixel map shows you the pixel values from your sensor. Let's take a look at it. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce the distance between the orange lines, the capture region, so that we're sampling fewer pixels. Okay, so now there's the exposure for each pixel. I'm going to scroll to the right till I find my data. There it is. So those are the actual pixel ADU values. And the 2D pixel map can handle a lot of data in real-time video or a video playback, but not so for the 3D. It's a real resource hog. It's doing a lot of calculating and display updating. So keep the orange lines really close together and the frame rate down to use the 3D pixel map. You can also speed it up by creating a subregion that you want to sample. Hold the control key down and the left mouse button and just bracket in that region. And you can see there, we're just looking at that one small region between the orange lines inside the red box. And you can see it's relatively fast and it can handle high frame rates because there's so few pixels involved. Okay, now here's a wonderful brand new feature, real-time cropping of video images. It's easy to use. Just use the left mouse button and the control key to frame in an area. Once you've done that, put a check mark down here. You can see in the video, we've done a nice zoom, we can see the image better, and you get a lot more speed because there's so few pixels involved in this. You can even rotate and use the 3D pixel map once you've done this kind of cropping. So the crop button and this new panel here are also available when you're playing back a video file on this tab. So what we've looked at so far really is focused on speeding up RSpec videos. The software has always been fast, and now it's even faster. In most cases, you'll only use a handful of these features, if any of them. But I wanted to show them to you so you knew they were available. I encourage you to experiment in the daytime with these features so you're comfortable using them. Just fire up your camera, even if it's capped, and play with the new controls to get a feel for how they work.